I love roguelike deck builders. I can't get enough of them, and have sunk far more time into this singular subgenre than almost any other, and I'm incredibly excited whenever I get the chance to dive into a new one that's packed with fresh ideas, gorgeous card art, and wild new synergies to discover and cheese as much as I possibly can. There's no other genre quite like it in my opinion, and I'm positively ecstatic that they've absolutely exploded onto the market over the last 3 years. And as such, I figured I'd sit down and put together a list of 10 roguelike deck builders that I consider to be worth playing. I should mention, however, that this is not a comprehensive list at all. I've got about 60 other roguelike deck builders of varying merit, and there's just no way I'm going to be able to list them all in one video, especially with even more rad new contenders on the horizon. So if I don't mention a game, don't worry, I'll likely include it in 10 more roguelike deck builders that are worth playing sometime next year. For organization's sake, I'm going to split this video up into 2 categories, starting with traditional deck builder roguelikes that are all pretty similar mechanically with customizable decks, energy management, generally one protagonist and or health pool that matters, run-changing relics, and so on. As such, all of these can be enjoyed fairly equally, and due to their similarities are very easy to learn how to play once you're experienced with one of them. There is a decent chance you'll burn out eventually, but that'll be after a couple hundred hours or more. To almost no one's surprise, the first game on my list is Slay the Spire, as it pretty much single-handedly popularized the genre and remains one of the better ones available, if not the best. Sure, Slay the Spire might feel generic in comparison to some other roguelike deck builders at this point, but that's largely because it's been around for so long and pioneered many of the design conventions that are now core features to the genre across the board. Sure, roguelike deck builders existed prior to Spire, but none of them had the sheer level of impact that it did, and the vast majority that were released in its wake have generally all followed the same formula, with limited energy pools, hands and deck management, constant card rewards, brutal boss fights, game-changing relics, and so on. Despite its many successors' attempts to further innovate on the formula, Slay the Spire still remains at the pinnacle of the genre, owing a lot to Megacrit's near-perfect balance of mechanics, synergies, and genuinely challenging gameplay. The other reason why I feel that Slay the Spire still has so much potential years after its release is the extremely passionate community mod support that it continues to receive. I recently loaded it back up again to try the total overhaul mod Downfall that lets players play as the iconic floor bosses descending the spire while fending off the base game's playable characters at the end of every floor. It's such a genius reversal, and for me might actually be more fun than the base game. And that's just one mod. There are hundreds more that I haven't tried that will help Slay the Spire remain fresh and exciting for a long while. Ultimately, I recommend Slay the Spire to anyone that is a fan of the roguelike deck builder genre or is looking to dive in for the first time. The game's base difficulty might be a bit steep for beginners, but by learning and mastering it, you'll be more than prepared to tackle any other game in the genre with ease. Monster Train is, without a doubt, the absolute best of the genre at the moment in terms of visuals, music, gameplay, and build potential. Heck, the only reason why I didn't put it first was due to the difference in community mod support, and even then, it's close competition. Monster Train is just that good, with some of the common DNA pulled from other deck builders, but far more individual identity than most. Namely, instead of controlling one singular static character, you fill your deck with monsters that are placed on one of 3 floors of your train engine, and instead of keeping them alive, you're trying to stop foes from reaching the top and destroying your core at all costs instead. This creates an absolutely massive amount of build potential that no other deck builder comes close to matching. Sure, there are some pretty obvious combos, especially with the 12 champion monsters that are ostensibly the main monster for each playthrough, but at the same time, they don't have to be. Some of my best, most memorable runs were focused on completely different monsters, and exploiting their unique traits to absolutely crush all challengers. A lot of why Monster Train is so good is because it's intentionally imbalanced, both in the player's favor and against them. The whole game is an arms race of difficulty, especially with the last Divinity DLC, where players are practically required to discover and exploit busted combos to have a chance at victory, which leads to some truly incredible runs. Monster Train is also the only roguelike deck builder that I know of with an unmodded form of multiplayer, allowing players to simultaneously compete against each other for the highest score possible on seeded runs, where you can see your competition on the map alongside you, or are the graves of those who tried and failed along the way. It's hardly the primary draw, but it is incredibly cool all the same. Ultimately, I recommend Monster Train to roguelike deck builder fans who want more of a monster collection feel, a ridiculous amount of lateral variety, or goofy, busted builds that break the game in half. Where Monster Train was a bit of a hard departure from the core formula pioneered by Slay the Spire, while remaining fairly similar, Vault of the Void feels more like a refinement, as it features only a handful of unique characters and a plethora of builds for each of them, but with a greater focus on the fly deck management that is absent in pretty much the rest of the genre. Unlike the other deck builders on this list, Vault of the Void does not force you to use every card in your deck, and instead lets you swap them out between battles as long as you maintain a fixed amount in your deck at all times, with a sideboard for everything that you do not want or need. This is incredibly helpful, as most deck builders bog you down with cards that might only be situationally useful. Vault lets you store those cards until a situation actually calls for it, like AoEs for large groups or slow combos for longer fights. It's also one of the most aesthetically pleasing out of all of the deck builder roguelikes that I have played to date. The developer is an art director as their main job, and that really carried through into Vault of the Void's artwork, UI design, effects, and so on. I honestly wish more people gave Vault of the Void a shot, as it's a certified underrated indie gem as far as I'm concerned. Ultimately, I recommend Vault of the Void for anyone who loves roguelike deck builders but is tired of dealing with deck bloat or useless starter cards, or for players drawn to exceptionally beautiful card art. Based on the tabletop board game of the same name, Tainted Grail takes the core formula that they built there and fuses it seamlessly with roguelike mechanics. I think. I haven't actually played the board game yet. That said, Tainted Grail is a solid contender on this list, with 9 playable classes and multiple potential builds therein. For extra variety to differentiate between runs, there is rune-based gear customization, a greater focus on questing and choice-based events, and some rogue-light meta-progression mechanics to give future playthroughs a boost. It's also the only game on this entire list with full 3D visuals, so if you're not a fan of more illustrated graphics, then I hope you enjoy maximum grimdark fantasy, because Tainted Grail has it in spades, but visually and thematically. It's a fun game for sure, but I can tell you with almost complete certainty that none of the characters you encounter in this game are really happy to be there. Well, except for maybe you, the player, dunking on foes using some seriously busted builds. That's always fun. Ultimately, I'd recommend Tainted Grail for experienced deck builder roguelike fans who want to get fairly invested into fine-tuning a build and want more quests, world building, and lore to get immersed in while they play. Another clay masterpiece of Don't Starve fame, Griftlands is a fantastic narrative-based roguelike deck builder, except there are 2 unique playstyles, one for combat and one for diplomacy, with similar but distinct rules for each. Almost every problem in the game can be approached from multiple angles, and while there are some truly inevitable fights, many could be avoided or drastically changed by taking a diplomatic approach first. It makes for a cool dichotomy, and gives you a chance to rest and recuperate without having to worry overmuch about being dragged from one brutal fight to the next. Especially because you can often use one style to complement the other, like convincing a nearby NPC to lend a hand, or resolving an argument with your fists after negotiations break down. There's also a very solid story-based element to Griftlands, where each chapter has a semi-branching narrative that you can play through multiple times to see different outcomes and paths. Even the NPCs are randomly selected, along with their respective networks of friends, foes, likes, and dislikes, so even if you decide to play through the same arc a second time, you'll likely have a fairly different experience along the way. Ultimately, Griftlands is one that I would recommend to people looking for a deck builder with more of a traditional RPG feel, or want to get invested into one run rather than several shorter ones. Unlike more traditional roguelike deck builders, these tend to veer rather far from the core formula, and thus stand out substantially in their own way. As such, they might not necessarily resemble the first 5 games on my list, which honestly is a huge positive if you're trying to find something new and interesting to try out. The Guild of Dungeoneering is an odd duck, straddling the line between traditional deck builder gameplay and more of a quasi-puzzle risk-reward RPG where your cards are tied to your ability levels, which are in turn granted by pieces of equipment that you find after slaying enemies. There isn't a tremendous amount of proper deck building in Dungeoneering, apart from trying to min-max your ability deck as well as a small handful of perks that allow you to draw more cards here and there. But at the same time, it is by far the easiest to pick up and put down on this list, with most runs averaging about 5 to 15 minutes at the longest. It's positively bite-sized, yet has a tremendous breadth of content and a fair amount of challenge, so you won't get bored of playing that easily. Especially with the newly released Ultimate Edition that is by and far the best version of the game, with rebalanced classes to make them all equally viable and fun, as well as other changes that reflect years worth of player feedback and testing. Ultimately, Guild of Dungeoneering is one that I would recommend to folks looking for a lightweight game to play idly while working on other tasks, or for something easier to pick up and master than the rest of the games on this list. While I would balk at calling Meteorfall Journeys and Meteorfall Crewmate's Tale bite-sized, they're both absolutely fantastic deck builders built with phones in mind, but without any of the greedy design decisions that plague most mobile games. Frankly, if the rest of the market followed the Meteorfall model, it would be a vastly different place. Definitely nicer. But beyond that, the Meteorfall games are pretty unique on this list, where your cards are shuffled into a deck with enemies and hazards that fill out a 3x3 grid that must be cleared out tile by tile. To win, you have to carefully use your abilities, limited use items, and dwindling health pool to eliminate every foe in the deck. It can be pretty tense, especially if RNG is not in your favor, but the payoff of a great run is well worth it. It also has an absolutely beautiful, kinda ghoulish, Adventure Time adjacent art style that is a joy to behold whenever I load it up. Ultimately, Meteorfall is a weird beast, and one I'd highly recommend to players looking for something different, challenging, and more akin to a puzzle game than the rest of the games on this list. Gordian Quest is actually pretty similar to the more traditional roguelike deck builders, with energy pools, careful deck management, unique relics and powerful abilities, and blisteringly difficult battles and boss fights that will test your deck and strategies to their limits, with two key differences. Firstly, Gordian Quest is actually a deck builder RPG with a purely optional roguelite mode that carries some rewards over into the main game. And it's really good, like surprisingly good for a side game mode. It's clear that the developers have put a fair bit of thought and effort into making it work, and as such, it more than justifies Gordian Quest's inclusion on this list. Secondly, Gordian Quest is party-based, where the players control 3 separate and notably distinct heroes instead of one singular entity, each with their own cards, mechanics, and resource pools. There are a few other deck builder roguelikes that also take the party-based approach, but Gordian Quest undeniably does it better, at least for now. Ultimately, Gordian Quest is a great alternative for people looking to dive into the roguelike deck builder genre for the very first time, want a much heavier, synergy-focused style of play that few others in the genre really offer, or are less interested in roguelike gameplay and want something more structured and linear. Ring of Pain isn't even a deck builder. Why are you including it on this list? Because it's that good, alright? And it has cards, so it kinda counts. Look, I just want to signal boost this specific game more, because it's truly incredible. There are only a handful of games that have managed to absolutely turn me around from vague disinterest to absolute enthusiasm, and Ring of Pain did it with a bare-bones demo. That and their constant use of creepy poetry on social media, which is always a treat to read. The core gameplay centers around you moving left or right on a ring of cards, either attacking or passing foes, grabbing new items, and trying very, very, very hard not to die on your way down. It's punishingly difficult, with one of the steepest difficulty cliffs I've seen in a roguelike in ages, despite its simple facade. And yet every time I load the game up, I feel compelled to play at least a handful of runs until I manage to get a particularly busted combo that will not only carry me to victory, but to absolutely demolish everything in my path. It's an experience largely exclusive to roguelikes, especially the deck builder variety, and there's truly nothing quite like it. Ultimately, Ring of Pain is a solid choice if you're looking for something lightweight and wholly unique, yet with enough depth to keep you coming back for more, and more, and more, and more. Lastly is Ratropolis, which is what happens when you try and take the core formula from Raw Fury's Kingdom series, make it about adorable medieval rats, and then add extremely deep deck building and unbelievably punishing foes to really spice things up. It's a fantastic fusion of ideas that I have been absolutely craving when playing the Kingdom games, yet it stands truly on its own at the same time. In contrast to most of the other deck builders on this list, Ratropolis eschews the traditional energy system in favor of gold, where almost every card has a cost to play, either to build new buildings, to cast a spell, summon new units, make more money, or one of a dozen other things. Which means that you'll not only be focused on driving off invading forces, but also on carefully balancing your economy so you're able to keep up with the constant deluge of threats coming from both sides of the map. This money-based card system works perfectly and allows for some really unique and interesting styles of play that I haven't seen in another game to date. I should mention that Ratropolis is also probably the most merciless, stressful, and unfair of the games on this list, where RNG will sometimes deny you one or multiple extremely necessary cards for victory, alongside events that will sometimes set you on an endless doom spiral, but if you're willing to put up with this stress, the payoff is well worth it in the end. Ultimately, Ratropolis might appeal to players of the Kingdom series more than Roguelike Deckbuilder fans, but it has enough challenge and depth for all to enjoy, especially if you like making gargantuan megaducks that cannot be stopped. And that's it, at least for now. Every single game on this list is an absolute banger as far as I'm concerned, and I seriously hope that I was able to recommend one or several that you've never heard of before, owned but haven't played, or just reignited your interest in a roguelike deck builder that's been collecting dust in your library. And if none of these were new to you, don't worry, I have dozens of candidates for 10 more roguelike deck builders that are worth playing, and will include the absolute best of them in that video, or maybe the video after. Speaking of, if you have a favorite roguelike deck builder on this list, and I know people are going to say Inscription, feel free to leave a suggestion in the comments below. For the sake of brevity, I won't be able to include everything in the next video, but I want to consider every potential option before doing so. And if there's another genre, subgenre, category, or style that you'd love to see me cover, suggest it below as well. Lastly, if you'd like to help support the creation of more videos like this, please leave a like, hit subscribe, check out some of my previous videos on this channel, or consider becoming a member or Patreon. These videos take a while to make, and the more support that I get, the more I can make in turn. So with that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.